on even the last few hours. Okay, we will revisit that at the end. And I would like, since it's the second class and we got all of the housekeeping out of the way for the most part, I would like to have time to write at the end. So I'll be sure to watch our clock. Were we able to print? We're going to be putting it up anyway, the handouts, but can you just raise your hand just if you were able to print, just so I have a sense of who's looking at a hard copy, if at all. Okay, Janice, great. Okay, wonderful.
Is it possible?
Okay.
Vanessa, is it possible to send that link again with the with today's writing?
The link with today's writing.
I'm having trouble locating it in my ridiculous inbox.
Do you mean what Vanessa posted in wet ink?
Yes.
So it's also, yeah, Lindsay, it's also in wet ink. Are you able to navigate over there?
Yeah, let me try that again.
Let me put the I will go ahead and put it in the chat room as well.
Okay.
Just
Thank
put in
you. I don't mean to slow us down.
Oh, no, not at all. Lindsay, also, you know, it's an odd thing, but when I Googled Bernadette Mayer Midwinter Day through Google Books, the entirety of the text, I just checked it out like 2 minutes before class, was available to view. Barbara,
Okay.
awesome.
Okay.
So that's an alternate, if for free, it's not the real thing. It's not the hard copy, which is ideal, but it's something if you can't find it in Kelly's chat or in wet ink, but we're going to be putting it up as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anything else before we move on? Okay, so I'd like to read a quote by Bernadette Mayer, who is still writing, who is still living, who is still with us. She says about this text, I had an idea to write a book that would prove the day, like the dream, has everything in it. I'm gonna let that sit there for a second. Before we hear some other voices reading some of Midwinter Day's excerpt for us, I would love to hear, if you'd like to read aloud, just a few words about this text. This is a text written in 1982, which already might conjure some contextual significance in terms of politics, in terms of sociopolitics, in terms of gender dynamics. This was written as an epic poem about a daily routine. Epic poetry, even if we're not connoisseurs, I'm sure we all have come across some version of an epic poem. The first, I think, being Gilgamesh as the first evidenced epic poem. It's page 67 when we get there, page 66 and 67 when we get there, for those asking. The Odyssey, so on and so forth. What Bernadette Mayer attempts to do with this conceptual text, for me, is to give a feminist revision of the epic poem as a form. It's in 6 parts. We are excerpting from part 4, I believe, and then part 5 or part 6. We'll see in a second. It begins on the note of dream work, and it goes all the way through December 22nd, 1982, to sleep. So from waking and dreams prior to sleep. It is the shortest day of the year, December 20th.
This is not matching up what I'm showing on the screen, what you're reading.
Oh no, I'm just giving my own notes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, just, you know, I was just saying, I just wanted to say a few things before we jump
Oh,
in.
I'm sorry, Vanessa. Okay.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Okay. Yeah, just some stuff to ground us in what we're getting into, because it is an excerpt. We're not looking at page 1. I just wanted to give us a little bit of grounding. So I have excerpted from 2 parts. Let's look at page 66. Before we do, Kelly, just one more note. This concept of a single day, the expansion of a single day. And I think, Evelyn, I took a look at your piece that you posted, and I think I commented on your wonderful ease between expansion and compression, temporal expansion and compression. It'll probably make more sense if you take a look at my comment, if you haven't already. But what Mayer is doing here is experimenting with time happening all the time, which is a really modernist concept if we think back to someone like Joyce, James Joyce with Ulysses, which sort of revisits the Odyssey. And of course, you know, I'm reading Virginia Woolf, I'm rereading her, so she's in my mind as well, Mrs. Dalloway. This idea of a single day for the modernist subject and what fits into that day. What I love about the excerpts we're going to look at, and we'll unpack them and do what we do with them, and then think about our own work in relation to them. But what I love is that there's an attempt to marry the life of the mother with the life of the artist. So how does the working mother, how does the artist mother function throughout a day? What is the interiority of this subject? So that's just a little bit to ground us. Bernadette Mayer, the last thing I'll say, is part of the language school, capital L, as she has 1 foot in the language school and 1 foot in the New York school, capital N, capital Y. So someone like Frank O'Hara, we might know as part of the language school, very much an I see this, I do that poet. I walk down Fifth Avenue and I see the construction workers on my lunch break from the Med, so on and so forth. She's a language poet because she's also bending and treating language as a malleable object. And we'll see what we mean when we get into it a little bit more. So page 66, we have 4 pages essentially that I want to look at. These are rich, dense pages, so we will try to do our best with them. Thanks, Kelly. So if you're looking at wet ink, great. I'm sorry that I can't share my screen. It's just, I think it's a little too complicated on my end with my iPad. So let's start with Marie says, and we will stop at the last line of the last full paragraph. Cuisinart, she said she didn't want one. So on that same page, right before everything is edible, which is the first line of the next paragraph. Great. Anyone who didn't read last time and who'd like to lend their voice, I'll open it up to you first. We'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to read this one side, and then if not, we'll move on to someone that wants to. Anyone who cares to read today?
I'll read.
Thank you.
I haven't read it yet, so this is a first rough draft. Marie says she wants to read a book before I fix the rest of the dinner. Verlaine had a terrible life. He was poor, a kind of vagabond. His wife forbade him to see his son. He had an affair with Rimbaud, and he died of many different diseases. For years, he was so sick, he used to spend the winters in the hospital. He was famous, and his son edited his works. Lewis was just reading a biography of him. We read Betsy and the Doctor, where Betsy falls out of a tree while she's at nursery school and hits her head on a stone. She goes to the doctor, and not only does she have to have stitches, but an injection in her head as well. Once an old friend of mine was driving me to the airport, and she crashed into a taxi at Broadway and Houston Street. My head hit the windshield, and when the police came, they told me I should say I'm a model and sue. They called an ambulance, but at the hospital, they only ripped the cut apart in a rough way and rubbed it with something. Then later, a doctor had to remove the glass from my head after the cut was healed. And it was only the day after the accident I realized it was my knee that was fractured. And my friend Kathy told me maybe I did it on purpose. She said she was mad at me because she thought I had slept with her boyfriend, who was my sister's ex-husband. You can't even see the scar. I love chopping vegetables where you do something to make something that is one idiosyncratic thing into many things, all looking the same or identical, much like the vegetable's original seeds. How rapt attention is to doing this as if it were a story. I remember Bill saying how he and Beverly, when they began to be short of money, couldn't understand why when Clark wanted to buy Susan a Cuisinart, she said she didn't want one.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lindsay.
Wow, that was a ride.
Say more, Lindsay. Not to put you on the spot, but any
Right.
impressions as a reader?
Yeah, it's just it's an overlapping ride of realities, is what it feels like. And really, I felt the demand to be in the present moment. And if I got attached to where I had been, then the transition took over rather than being where I was next asked to be.
Right.
Which is challenging. Which, you know, it's not how we breathe.
Mm.
Well, I disagree. I think it is how we write. I think it's so much stream of consciousness, how one thing leads to another. I mean, you mentioned Ulysses. I did look at these last night and made a few notes. And I do think it is how we write. We put down what comes to mind, particularly, I mean, there's some overarching things in this whole segment about food and things like that, but that's another issue. But if you look in this second paragraph, you know, how one thing leads to another, how she reads the story and then she remembers the accident. And then, then she goes on removing the glass from her head. And then in the last paragraph, where she starts with the chopping of the vegetables and they morph into something else. And then she goes into this memory of Bill and Beverly, and then how she doesn't understand why Susan doesn't want the Cuisinart. So I think it is how we, you know, what do we come up with? And then in our process, what do we take out? That's our challenge. How do we edit? That's what I'm going through. I posted something, I don't know if you saw it last night, but that's how we edit. We say, what can we overwrite? And then we remove. So I think, but I love it flowed. I personally liked it very much.
I want to mention, if I could, the idea of associations that are made. I'm really fascinated by the part about the friend. Maybe I did it on purpose. There was a lot of humor in that for me. The way that we can't really see other people's motivations. We only get what they tell us that their motivations are. We can't really read it. And here we get that she said she was mad at me because she thought I might have slept with her boyfriend. And so I'm just really, the lens on that piece of it, this whole idea that everyone is bringing their own associations to what's going on for us. And so I was really fascinated with that little tidbit. I really found the humor in the whole piece too.
Any other thoughts, responses? This excerpt comes almost a few pages, almost at the start of part 4. So our speaker, our I, has begun her, well, she begins the day in part one, of course, but she begins the concrete work, the concrete labor of the day. She's already in the throes of that. So I want to look at the architecture of this, how we move freely and associatively from Marie says she wants to read a book to I remember Bill saying how he and Beverly, when they began to be short of money, couldn't understand why when Clark wanted to buy Susan a Cuisinart, she said she didn't want one. So let's just look at that first paragraph. We'll take this this is sort of in a triplet, 3 paragraphs. Marie says she wants to read a book before I fix the rest of dinner. Verlaine had a terrible life. He was poor, a kind of vagabond. His wife forbade him to see his son. He had an affair with Rimbaud, and he died of many different diseases. For years, he was so sick, he used to spend the winters in the hospital. He was famous, and his son edited his works. Lewis was just reading a biography of him. Okay, so just to ground us a little, Marie, we're to understand is a daughter. Lewis is a husband. And then we have what I love, that's what bookends this paragraph. But what comes in between is the use of allusion, ALLUSION, the reference, the literary jumping to intertextualization. So we have Verlaine, the French symbolist of the mid 19th century, and Rimbaud, modernist, surrealist, also at the same time, lovers at one point. What I love is that when you hone in on this paragraph, and again, the book doesn't begin here, this is where we begin. So we'll take that with a grain of salt. But when we look at this vehicle, this little paragraph, we bookend with daughter and husband, and what fills the substance of this interior sort of monologue is literature, right? Are these literary giants that the I uses as touchstones to then what? To then get us to paragraph 2. Like what is unlocked in this paragraph that we then get the transition to, we read Betsy and the Doctor, where Betsy falls out of a tree while she's at nursery school and hits her head on a stone. So I love that we get the juxtaposition between high art, quote unquote, French literature, and not even necessarily literature, the men behind that French literature. And then we get the child story, Betsy and the Doctor, which is, sort of primary remedial. And we get the two, so the contrast, just in terms of the how, we talked about the how with Daisy Zamora. How is she constructing? We as writers want to feel just as much as we want to understand how one sort of crafts their work. And it's hard to use an example like this and break it down and unpack it, because I think, like Evelyn said, I think it was Evelyn, apologies if it wasn't, we jump very naturally to a certain extent, but then to Lindsay's point, very unnaturally, in terms of being asked to stay in the present moment. And yet we have all these lateral moves. So she goes to the doctor's, and not only does she have to have stitches, but an injection in her head as well. Once, an old friend of mine was driving me to the airport, and she crashed into a taxi at Broadway and Houston Street. Okay, so we have moved from the daughter to French symbolism to the husband reading about the authors of French symbolism to the primary text of children, to what they read about in these sort of primary texts, and how that is almost the linchpin between her imagination reading to her daughter, and then they're reverting back to memory. So her use of memory as just as present as the current moment happens often, and it often happens with the word once, which is which is sort of an easy key. Once an old friend of mine was driving to the airport and crashed into a taxi at Broadway in Houston. My head hit the windshield. And when the police came, they told me I should say I'm a model and sue. They called an ambulance, but at the hospital, they only ripped the cut apart in a rough way and rubbed it with something. Then later, a doctor had to remove the glass from my head after the cut was healed. And it was only the day after the accident that I realized it was my knee that was fractured. And my friend Kathy told me, dialogue, maybe I did it on purpose. She said she was mad at me because she thought I might have slept with her boyfriend, who was my sister's ex-husband. You can't even see the scar. So, sort of to Kelly's point about, I'm rephrasing here, but this nature of how we perceive and perception and others unto us, the I is sort of, the only realization or voice the I has here is I realized it was my knee that was fractured, right? This physical experience. But everyone else, from the police to the doctor to the friend, is telling unto the I, which is a really interesting location for the I to be. Where is the I? And that's sort of a question I'll ask as we thread through this. Where is the I located as we develop over these next pages? Then what's wonderful is that we get back to the task at hand, the actual work at hand, making dinner. Which is, right, again, let's go back to that first line. Marie says she wants to read a book before I fix the rest of dinner. So all of this happens, the memory, the illusion, the alluding to, etc., happens in the moment that she's reading and before dinner. And then we get the action of, I love chopping vegetables, where you do something to make something that is one idiosyncratic thing into many things, all looking the same or identical, much like the vegetable's original seeds. I love her use of repetition here, and how vague this statement is, and yet how much I feel this to a certain extent, having chopped vegetables, having sat there and to do that work, what you begin to notice about the mundane. So the way the vast exists next to the mundane, and I would say she refuses competition of the two. One doesn't get more say than the next. One isn't at the forefront more than the other. How does one, and I think this is to an earlier comment about editing, but I would add to that, is so much about balance, the composition. The point is, if the point is to intermingle parts of identity as a woman, as a mother, and as a writer, how do you compose a piece that holds those two equally? How rapt attention is to doing this as if it were a story. I remember Bill saying how he and Beverly, when they began to be short of money, couldn't understand why when Clark wanted to buy Susan a Cuisinart, she said she didn't want one. I love this mention of the Cuisinart. That's like a very postmodern, post-World War II literary device to mention brand names and sort of this open up to this marketing world and this world of capitalism in 1982 that I think really underpins nicely and subtly the landscape. This is New England, 1982, December 22nd, 1982. I think Lewis and Bernadette had rented a house from an artist couple at the time and stayed there for the summer and then into the winter, I think. But they didn't have a ton of money. So certainly home economics, I hate using that term, but the economy of the home is of course present here as well. The division of labor is a phrase I will put out before we move on. The division of labor, of course, between man and husband and wife, man and woman. How is that refused to embrace the intermingling of art, intellect, poetry, motherhood? So how is she progressing that? How might this be a progressive text in that way? Okay, with some of that in mind, and that's just some of the things that I noticed, let's finish this other side. Anyone up for reading from Everything is Edible to the bottom of 67, where it says $40?
I can do it.
Thanks.
Okay. Everything is edible. It's a long story. Coins or cubes or tree rings of carrots, like the slices of trees at our tables in the library yard. Canoes of celery, like the clergy, where something with strings attached. Miniature trees of broccoli, and if you are poor enough to want to cook the whole plant, they're inevitable tree stumps that look like primitive clouds. Moses used to have cauliflower ears, now covered by curls like grated carrots, last quarter moons of onions, or bloated apostrophes, crumbled papers with typographical errors of chopped spinach or greens, unseaworthy boats of rigid turnips in which the survivors resort to cannibalism rather than eat the odoriferous boats. Railroad ties for French fries, sleepers, the third estate, the common people. Oldenburgs to go into stew, or a peasantish flying saucer for a meatloaf, or the flapping wings of the memory of rich pounded veal, where I am crushing flesh between waxed paper with a hammer in the kitchen, if I can afford it. The commas of the cheapest small onions for the sauce, the olive oil's drops on the map of the pot of tomatoes, letters of the straight pasta and the prunes in the soup, with Twombly's, our arbitrary split moons of the half peas, the camera lenses of the lentils, homogenized script of the mass rice, foreplay with a nice knife at butter. My mother used to have a pressure cooker, but she made it clear she was afraid it would explode any minute. When she cooked carrots in it, she had a habit of saying, "It's too bad they taste earthy." You want me to go on from there?
Yeah, please.
Okay. We're only having spaghetti. Once on my mother's birthday, which was April 4th, we went for a picnic to Clarence Fonstock State Park, and I refused to get out of the car. She also had a habit of regretting she hadn't married somebody rich, like the man who used to take me out in a taxi. Continue. Bright sun is on everything. It's on the ice, on the roofs, on wet street, on Marie in the kitchen. It's making parallelograms on the walls of the rooms. I like to play poker. Poe was an incessant gambler, and Hawthorne got in trouble for gambling at school. Once I made a bluff so large I blushed, but I got away with it and won $40.
Thanks, Barbara. Any thoughts after reading aloud?
I just love the way the mind goes. I mean, it reminds me of when I'm sitting and meditating and have monkey mind.
Right. Actually, can we stay on that? So when I first got into meditating, of course, the idea is, I would think that the practice was in, and the merit was in not letting the mind wander. And then I quickly realized it was in the letting it wander, but where the meditation happens for me is in the pulling back to the breath, right? It's in that sort of liminal space, or whatever that transitional thing is, that tension of drawing it back gently. So if we could think about that space against my question, where is the I located? Where is her mind? What does she see? Oh, she thinks of a lot, but what is she preoccupied by at really the center? Where does that pulling back happen for her? And maybe we don't have that answer yet, but I think, Barbara, that comment you made just made me think of that, which I hadn't thought of before. So perhaps something we could think about. Any other reactions to this stretch? How it builds, how it brings up something new?
It feels like it's an interesting series of bearing witness. You know, when you thought about meditation and the monkey mind, you know, that work of just allowing the monkey mind to be, not being in judgment of it, but just bearing witness to, yep, there it is. And then let it fall away and go back to the breath, you know. And almost in this, you know, kind of exotic, almost erotic
Mm.
discussion of vegetables, you know, commas and bloated apostrophes, and you know, it's extraordinary. And meat and you know, food in general.
I agree with you, Lindsay, and I love where the food takes her into all of these kinds of things, like the rings of carrots, like slices of trees, and the canoes of celery, like the clergy. I mean, just all of these things. And it took me a while to get my arms around who she's referring to as Moses, but
Yeah.
I think it's a pet, a dog, but I'm not sure. But you know, things like that. And then she comes back to the reality in the next to last paragraph. She comes back to reality, has all of these comments about these the food and what she makes of them, the meatloaf like a flying, as if it's a flying saucer, things like that. I mean, I was very taken with that. And then she's only having spaghetti.
Yes, yes.
I love the way she comes back to that. And then she comes to her mother. And her mother, in just a few short sentences, we learn so much about her mother that, you know, there's this tension. She won't get out of the car. She's probably a pre or early pubescent daughter and things like that. And her mother had this mantra of, why didn't she marry the guy who took her out in a taxi? You know, maybe they weren't rich enough. And so she was going out with a guy who was rich. And then she comes back to the present because she looks at the sun and the ice and Marie's in the kitchen. And then she goes into her passion of poker and how she was able to do a what's she call it? She, but she still won. So I just love the way she takes us through food. It's a real journey.
Mm. And it revises the epic journey of the male sort of Greek figure, right? Or Odysseus, or even a Joycean character through the day. What is the epic life of a woman, you know, in midwinter, which is very profound. I think I feel that very deeply. Janice, you mentioned too her diction, you know, her allusion to Moses, which could double as a pet, but of course it has its biblical resonance, as does clergy. So she's still drawing upon these words that are, you know, have their roots in religion. And then she moves to cannibalism a little ways down there. And then she goes to the Oldenburgs. I'm not sure if anyone noted, I think Rochelle is our resident painter. But the Oldenburgs, the Poons and the Twombleys, sculptors, abstract painters, men, but of course the pluralization of that suggests maybe the couples, right, having them over for dinner, but the way she's utilizing them and that humor that Kelly mentioned in the previous page, this sort of cheeky, you know, sassy, very smart way in which she weaves in these other artistic figures and into the stew, pun totally intended. And then of course that wonderful, we're only having spaghetti, right? And like the refuting of this idea that dinner is to be taken for granted, the work of dinner, because the work of dinner is all of the work of thinking through all of these these places and these people and the significance of literature and time and religion, and reworking them to be funny, to be humorous. So by the time we get to the end, I really, really like bright sun is on everything. And sort of she moves into like her poetic voice, which, by the way, none of us have commented, which I think is really interesting, on the fact that this is in prose. We're told that this is poetry, and you know, it brings up the distinctions between poetry and prose and the limitations of poetic convention, I think, for Bernadette Mayer, and the way in which the mind works sometimes in prose and sometimes in poetry, and it just sort of depends. We'll see in the next pair of pages, we move into something that looks a little more like traditional verse. But you might think, when does one use prose poetry or prose, and when does one employ more white space? This is the making of dinner, the presiding over the kitchen. That gets little breath, that gets little white space, it seems. And then we end, bright sun is on everything, it's on the ice, on the roofs. We have that lyrical sort of voice coming in, on the wet street, on Marie in the kitchen. It's making parallelograms on the walls of the rooms. I like to play poker. Interesting transition there. Poe is an incessant gambler, and Hawthorne got in trouble for gambling at school. Once I made a bluff so large that I blushed, but I got away with it and won $40. She's almost telling us, right, like through that memory, she's telling us the almost this sorcery, this trickery that she has done within it's a very meta moment for me, at least, like within, she's sort of cueing you to the work she's done in the last 2 pages, and probably before, which we don't have a chance to read today. Any other thoughts before we move to what looks a little more like traditional poetry? Okay, so we're at pages 102 and 103. We are moving from part 4 to part 6. This is the final act. Kelly, whenever you're ready. Great. Okay. So let's look at ice on the trees, and then we'll just stop at the bottom of that page. If anyone would like to read.
Okay, I'll read.
Thanks.
Ice on the trees is lit by streetlights. There's no moon yet. I slip because I'm racing by now for fear. Will I ever get home? What is reading and writing? This pledge to get to the desk which opens. It's a piece of wood like a boat, carved and cut and hinged and screwed to hold up the weight of my hands and arms, the typewriter and the beer. I have a mirror, and between 2 windows, which makes it so cold, I have to wear a down vest when I write. I'm lucky to have one. Wagner felt he had to wear satin dressing gowns in order to compose. I'm ashamed that death obsesses me, but death is just the usual. The obsessiveness is something I wanted in poker, where I'm remembering what's been played, so I can play my hand so no one ever dies. How preoccupying is the wish to include all or leave all out. Some say either wish is against a poem or art. I'm asking, is it an insane wish? To be besieged, beset with, to have to sit with, to be harassed, possessed, to be possessed or ruled by. I'm confused by fear, perfection, and love. This poem, order, mourning, vigilance, and beer, and cigarettes, and directness, or clarity, words, truth, or writing with a sublime. Every day, these apologies are what they call under control. I've no respect for the repetitious logic, and though I'm obsessed with keeping track. That's where you want me to end?
Yeah, actually, would you mind, Janice, just reading yeah.
Okay. Although I'm obsessed with keeping track of where you are in the house or out of it, I really can clean it thoroughly. Want me to go on?
That seems like a good place to rest.
Okay,
That's great,
yeah.
thanks.
It's
Yeah,
really
that didn't
transition-
seem,
transition.
yeah, I know, we can keep going.
Yeah,
And
I did, and I did this last time too. I printed
yeah,
out the poems in 2 copies and I made notes on one and kept the original. So
nice and clean. Yeah, that's a great idea. But yeah, I just wanted to stop there. We obviously, it is all seamless as it goes. But so we move into more playing across the page. We move into more pause, more, is it hesitation, more assertion? What do these indentations bring us? How is the eye capturing time and thought by part 6? We began, of course, again, these are unfair questions since we're not looking at the entirety of the book. But at least from what we looked at with part 4, we have something that's very intact, very dense, and then we move into something more fragmentary. So if we're looking at the way form speaks to content and vice versa, how have some of her questions changed, or are there more questions? What is the meditation on this page?
well, she's somewhat obsessed. Well, she's concerned about her writing. She wants to get home for it. And she's also concerned about her obsessions. And she's also grateful. She says she's lucky she has the vest. And then she goes into these things about Wagner and his wearing a dressing gown while he composed. And then I'm glad you pointed out some things in the other piece, because she goes back to her poker at the end, and she's obsessed with death and cigarettes, darkness and beer and things like that. And it's very interesting how she focuses in on herself a little bit.
Mm.
It's a struggle with her inner life. And I also wrote somewhere, I don't know why I did this, that she has a partner in all of this. And I don't know if her partner is her other self or her writing
Right.
self or whatever. We're
Right.
all many people. We're all different in our different roles in life. And so that's very interesting to me. And I think she's wrestling with some of that.
Mm.
Just one more thing, this
Yeah.
image of her desk, I mean, it is so beautiful. A piece of wood like a bow, carved and cut and hinged and screwed to hold up the weight of my hands and arms, the typewriter and the beer. I mean, it's just fantastic.
And isn't there an
And-
echo from the vegetables with the boat from the other section?
Right. I saw that too. I thought of that as well. There's a development to that metaphor. Moving from the kitchen or moving from one place of work to the next. Because again, I don't think I think she's holding these in balance. Though I hear Janice on her conflict, and I guess that's what I kind of want to dig into a little more, because I'm wondering about that too. What is her attitude toward having to hold these two things, to compose these two things? And I think some of, to try and attempt an answer, I want to look at the third line from the top. By now, for fear Will I ever get home? What is reading and writing? I mean, the sequence of those two lines is so powerful. This pledge to get to the desk, this pledge, not getting to the desk, but the pledge to get to the desk, which opens. It's a piece of wood like a boat, carved and cut and hinged and screwed to hold up the weight of my hands and arms, the typewriter and the beer. I love that little subtle, moment of that other necessity. I have a mirror bar. Janice stopped at beer, but that clause, I have a mirror, is to me really puts another layer around this. I'm between two windows, which makes it so cold. I have to wear a down vest when I write. I'm lucky to have one. How concrete, she literally between two windows, but figuratively, right? Like that emotional space that she occupies, that tension, that space. And then Wagner felt he had to wear satin dressing gowns. Interestingly, in just the pages we looked at, the allusions she employs are not to women. They are to male, German composers, French symbolists, her husband. The only female presence is her friend and her daughter. But in terms of intellectual intertextualizing, she hasn't referred to any women, which I find interesting.
No, but I think she has, if I can jump in.
Yes,
she is
please.
referring again to this gambling. So
Yeah.
she seemed to bringing up the writers and then bringing up gambling for her, where, so I'm getting the sense that this is also what she's talking about, perhaps in the idea of the woman writer or the woman artist, having to bluff and winning anyway. But then this is remarkable here in this piece of it, different because it's not so much about a bluff, but as a need to be paying attention to what has been played. So I just think that that's really brilliant. I'm just parsing it now, but what's been played so I can play my hand so no one ever dies. This intense risk that the writing is also, that the relationship with the writing and being a woman maybe also is saying. So I'm very struck by the image of being cold between the two windows and the physical embodiment of the idea of cold, and then sort of having this ability to warm herself up wearing the down vest, kind of an animal body of warmth, feathers. So I'm really interested in the framework that you're having us look at this from, Vanessa, and so that it's about gambling. And so so I think in the context of thinking about being a woman artist in a patriarchal history of what is taken as art, and what's been conserved in this really by these masculine artists, and then them being the gatekeepers perhaps of what it means to be an artist and how we express ourselves as artists. And then she's trying to get home to her own artistic expression, and that she's playing out how it's a gamble at this table of other artistic poker players.
I also, I put my 2 cents. I also love the beginning. I feel like we're building to what she says, I have a mirror. And that the mirror is her writing. Like she's looking back at herself through this mirror, which is her writing, which she's about to give us. And then I'm very taken with the structure and the fragmentedness of the structure
Yeah.
and how that's her mirror, is this portrayal of these, it's got to be intentional, right?
Yeah.
And, and what we see that's to the right, almost, I want to make it's its own poem almost, because it's not part of the other. So I just had questions about that and what other people, if that was, to me, that was like, there's a clue in there. But yeah, I love the mirror piece.
Lindsay, I appreciate your questions about structure, because I think you posed a question similarly about Samora's structure that I attempted to answer last time, in terms of the context and the individual and the relationship with the individual being the driving sort of momentum, the scaffolding, if you will. If we just look visually, just to attempt to parse that question, if we look at the way the right margin
Right.
works, right? So I'm just, as you're speaking, I'm thinking like, Wagner felt he had to wear, how preoccupying, I'm asking, I am confused by, every day. It almost creates this lovely poem within a poem. But there seems to be space before she posits these statements, before she invokes the Western musical canon with Wagner. And then what Kelly said about the stakes at the literal table of the canon, and then her questions, right? And what she's how preoccupying is the wish to include all or to leave all out? Some say either wish is against a poem or art. I'm asking, is it an insane wish? It is a little bit ambiguous. It has an ambiguous antecedent there, I think, purposely. To be besieged, beset with, I think we could add that into the right marginalia there. I am confused by, and then we go back to the left margin, every day. So what gets amplified through her use of playing across space and time are a sort of plea, confusion and a plea. And I think that, that's, therein lies the grappling, in terms of how one positions themselves, especially in 82, as a female artist, as a working female artist. In the interest of time, we'll just, if we could have one more reader, or I am happy to read, to take us out to that final page for today. If y'all don't mind, I'll go for it. I'm obsessed with how I look, but I don't pay any attention to it either. The structure of the past has always given me the feeling that as long as things are okay, there's a rhythm to that which chances are won't be broken. But once something awful happens, then you're in for it, as it doesn't fit. That's why I like recovering, and I'm always doing it. But when I think each time I write a line, I know someone I know won't approve of it, I begin to wonder about my mother. My mother thought it was opals that brought bad luck. Many people then used to say, people die in threes. My mother said, even if you try to get rid of an opal, it will bring you trouble. Lucky Chaucer said, I have great wonder, be this light, how I can live. I was going to tell about garbage and how taking it down to the yard ought to be a lucky pleasure, at least compared to any other place I've taken garbage down to. But like recovering from an illness or grief and rejoicing for a while in a new ordinary way of being, and then forgetting you were ever sick or aggrieved, pleasure without any change becomes a chore, though in some old hat division of labor. To change the subject, lovely to read her out loud. All right.
You added something when you read, you know that. When you said in that second line, I don't pay attention
did I?
to it either. Yeah, you said, I don't pay any attention to it either. I thought that was
Oh,
interesting. I thought that was really interesting.
oh no, my bad, as the kids say.
No, it's fine. It didn't break it. It just, it's just a natural tendency to
I
say
know.
any.
Right. And like we're in this stream of consciousness mode. So I'm just flowing, within the flow, which is
Right.
interesting.
I think it's so fantastic where she talks about, I know someone I know won't approve of it. I begin to wonder about my mother. And
Mm.
the woman's relationship with the mother so often is that she's not going to approve of anything I do. She always wants me to be better.
Yeah.
And for me, particularly, this whole thing about opals was my mother. If you weren't born in October, opals were bad.
Mm.
It's just this whole thing about the whole dynamic of mother-daughter there is so intense.
Yeah. Actually, Barbara, on that point, it's like, what parents this eye? It's the harking back to the mother. It's she and her daughter, but it's also the literary presence that, bears the writer. And the writer is born out of this tradition. And in order to speak back to it, to be critical of it, which I really love. And I'm sort of noticing as we revisit it, as we chat here, I see Lucky Chaucer. I like that qualifier for yet another canonical heavyweight. Going back to our gambling motif, the opal, of course, luck, so on. I was going to tell you, Janice, there I go again. I was going to tell about garbage.
Mhm.
I love that.
And I am interested in commenting on that line too. I think that in some ways, I'm glad you pointed out the way these single indented lines are really functioning as a poem within a poem. But once something awful happens, my mother said, Lucky Chaucer said, I was going to tell about garbage. So I'm wondering if this reference to garbage is also a reference to the internal critic.
Yeah.
And the mother as internal critic, or maybe even any of these other the artists that have come before this whole gamble, maybe it's all about garbage, taking it down to taking the garbage out. I mean, she gets a little bit distracted from that, but she is taking it down to the yard. And then maybe I'm a little confused about where she's going to with the idea of the garbage, but seems like she's just trying to remember the importance of taking something to the garbage, that recognizing, I don't know, I think the importance of taking some ideas to the garbage.
See, I had read that as the warring basic needs of the quotidian and the mundane, and that work of that domestic work that that needs to get done. Like I was like, there should be significance to that as well. Like we need to not overlook, and especially in our current moment, thinking about essentialism and what work is essential, and suddenly domestic work, the work of the realm of the woman has now, so many I think are opening their eyes a little more to what a day goes into a day now that everyone's at home. And so I was going to tell about garbage and how taking it down to the ought to be a lucky pleasure. She moves a little there, but at least those first two lines, I was going to tell about garbage and how taking it down to the yard, as though that is that is just as noble an act as internal conflict is, and in fact, it's part of the internal conflict. Ought, but then she moves a little, ought to be a lucky pleasure, at least compared to any other place I've taken garbage down to. So the yard, right? The yard as this this space where, you know, children run, where sort of, I think, suburbia or somewhere rural. So the dynamics are worked out in the yard.
Mhm.
Something along those lines.
But also, what you're saying, Vanessa, in this conversation about, you know, essential workers,
Yeah.
referring to Buddhism and meditation, reminds me of the saying, chop wood, carry water.
Mm,
That Buddha is just,
that,
it is in that ordinariness that,
yeah, yeah.
And after the ecstasy, the laundry.
yeah, exactly,
There's another
exactly.
one.
Yeah. And I love those, you know,
Yeah. And there's, I'm sorry, Lindsay, I cut you off.
no, that's it. Thank you.
This rejection of hierarchical labor divisions, I think, is really profound. That there's a rejection of the rhetoric around what is work that's noble, and even now, you know, the conversations about what's essential, I think, are itching to be opened up to, you know, so much. Like the basic needs of humanity, you know, are being called into question here, and I think we're figuring out, you know, as a country, how to reckon with that and how to reconcile with the fact that we haven't given proper, we've put things on a hierarchy, and now we need to somehow recover from that. I'm going to pause us here. Really, thank you for this discussion. It feels really good today to talk about Bernadette Mayer. Can we just look for the last 10 minutes? It's hard to write on cue at all, but can we do some closing just to take us out? This will all be posted right after class in the assignments page, per usual. So in thinking about how we're building to one sort of cumulative poem at the end of these 4 weeks, that's my goal, you know, not to overwhelm us, sort of gather as we go. But if you'd like to write a poem every week, that's, of course, you're more than welcome. I'm happy to read that. So revisiting the opening, let's play with this next exercise. Where might there be opportunities in your opening to expand your thoughts to unity in terms of formal and thematic elements? And you can rephrase that just for the sake of shorthand. But where might there be opportunities to expand your thoughts to unify formal and thematic aspects? For example, just to get us going and just to recap, where might we utilize prose beside poetry or traditional verse? Left margins, right margins, as part of an internal structure or engine. The mundane and the vast. The past alongside the present. Okay. So that's my prompt, but do with that what you will. Maybe you want to write some fresh stuff. Maybe you're not ready to revisit. You want to keep going. Maybe I cut you short before. In any case, let's try to do some writing. Another minute here. Okay, let's finish this thought. I think we could spend an hour and a half just on that stew passage, the clergy and Moses and French fries and the Poons and the Twombly's. But I hope our attention, the time we did spend, I hope it was helpful in getting a better sense of this writer's work and how it might inform yours. All of this, all of what I just said, the opening, the closing writing is scheduled on What Ink for 2:45. It'll be up there in a more articulate manner. Under our assignments page. Also, if you can remember to post any responses under that assignments page, just so that I don't miss. I know I happen to catch things on our homepage or on our discussion page, but I don't want to miss those things. So I'll continue looking in those places, but if we can keep everything in the assignments thread, that would be super helpful. Would anyone care to share, just to take us out, and no pressure. We're at about time anyway, excuse me. But if anyone would like to read, we'd be happy to listen. A piece of what you wrote, a line, a sentence, a set of lines. Barbara, thanks.
I was muted. Okay. This is from the beginning. Morning shaking, not usual, perhaps a dream. A fear on wakening, meditation on the app, not joined by anyone today, but that's okay. Breakfast with embarrassment of supplements, mushrooms, herbs, but mostly chocolate, serotonin. Figured out how to master TV. I don't do it very often. Hey, I like Lady Gaga. Didn't know she really sings. Joy and laughter. Yay, Woody Guthrie made it to the inaugural. Sang with Garth. Old man. Old non-believer can still cry over Amazing Grace. Saw Amanda's beautiful face and Poem of Hope. And somewhere in there, a new president who didn't once say, I am the greatest. And Kamala smiles with her eyes. And I want to hope unity does not mean stagnation for our nation, but a shift to those who deserve a better land. Will he take a stand for health and education for all, or will it fall? For now, I must just feel a passion for a nation based on hate and ownership of human beings, but perhaps it's not too late. And before I die, we'll see equality and justice really apply, and maybe we will save a world. I want to believe this woman of no belief.
It's wonderful. I love your power of internal rhyme. Barbara, I love your power of colloquialism. Hey, isn't that, I love that informal language, offhanded language underpins the loftier ideas that you're trying to articulate there. And the sonic element of it is carries it really beautifully. Thanks for sharing. Anyone else?
I'll just do a little bit. Sitting on the sofa, sipping lemon water, munching an apple. At last, the pièce de résistance. A 12-year-old girl, descendant of slaves, daughter of a single mother, can one day be president, but now writes a poem for a president. And I was just so taken with her. I'm going to write more about her. She's beautiful.
And a different treatment than, I know you're just reading a bit, but then Barbara's sort of surveyed, and yours like zooming in and really staying with that one figure. Sorry to keep you all over 2:30. Really, this was lovely. Next week and
I have a
the week
question.
after.
I'm sorry, Vanessa, before you go on, I have a question. Do you want us to be
Yeah.
working on one poem
Yeah.
that we would submit to you at the end of this, or what? I'm not, you keep saying we're working on something, and I just want to know where we're going with this. We're supposed to be writing.
So
version.
yeah. So ultimately I will give you a prompt for a single poem when we're done with week 4, to be due, let's say, a week after, whatever it is. But from week to week, I'd like us to focus on the reading aspect, the meeting for an hour and a half, and then the exercising parts of those tools that we got out of that day's reading. So last week we honed in on a few specific elements informed and inspired by Zamora. This week, my closing writing is based on Mayer, so that we're trying and experimenting with different devices, different approaches, so that when we come to that ultimate prompt, we have some tools that we've been gathering. Alternately, if you'd like to write a poem every week, inspired by the work we did during that session, you could totally do that. And people have posted that, poems online already, just that they, revisiting old poems or starting new ones, just inspired by Daisy Zamora or whatever we're reading. But really my goal is to have us write one poem by the end of this, to walk away with a really thoughtful, deliberate, rich poem. And until then, we are slowly but steadily working our way into that construction, so that by the time you sit down to that, you will hopefully feel like you're equipped. Does that make sense, Janice?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I just wanted some clarification because I did post a little bit of something. I'm struggling with a poem that I hope will ultimately develop about a woman's work.
And I'm happy to look at that. I'll
that
check
the one
wet
about
ink.
your
Like I said,
mother?
if it's not,
I put it in wet ink in a comment last night.
Yeah, is that the one about your mother, Janice?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I saw that and made a comment at it too.
Oh, good. I'll look at it. Thank you.
I'll take a look, Janice. Like I said, if we can try to put them in the assignments bubble department of Wet Ink, just so that they're all there. Because sometimes when we do comments and layer thread on top of thread, sometimes they get lost, and then I happen to see them, or I happen to do it, and I want to make sure I respond to you. The last thing I was just going to say before we say goodbye, next week and the week after, we will be looking at poems by one poet again, but those poems will not be coming from one text. They will be coming from disparate places. So I'll be linking those. They're not going to be scanned. They're not going to be PDFs. They're just readily accessible via the internet. So I'll post those, and then of course we'll screen share those. But it was really nice to look at Zamora's poems from one place and Bernadette Mayer's from one place, but now we're going to start to kind of expand a little bit outward. So we have one African-American poet to end us with, Marilyn Nelson, for our final class in honor of Black History Month. And then next week we're looking at an Iranian poet. So we got a nice global feel of women writers working on work.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much. This was really great.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Thanks, everybody.
Next time.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Vanessa.
Kelly. Thank you,
Thank you
Kelly,
for
for
reading
doing
my
what you
poem
do.
as
It's
well.
great.
Good to see everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
you.
See you next week. Bye-bye.
I will try and get back into ink again. For some reason, it didn't recognize me with my address. So I will try and just reset my password or something and see if it works.
Okay, check your spam folder if you haven't, just to see if they're sending you something, some kind of
Okay.
response. I can send you another invite too, Barbara. Let me try that. I'll try that right now.
Okay, I'll see if that works because I didn't really get, I did get my book though.
Wonderful. Enjoy that. I think you will.
Oh, yes, I'm going to start at the beginning because now I'm
Thank you.
curious.
Yeah, I think you'll savor that.
And
Thank you,
I'm
Kelly,
going-
for being tech master.
Oh yeah,
I'm
happy
gonna-
to.
Go ahead. I'm going to send you a poem I wrote